Thank you for coming this evening. Welcome to the second of our Monday evening lectures. Before I begin, I'm going to turn this over for 1 second to an announcement from Megan Funk from our friends at the Student Advisory Board.
So this is a PSA for the students. The Student Advisory Board is starting a new series that we're pairing up selected faculty members with a small group of students to have kind of intimate lunch about whatever you guys feel like talking about. This is kind of open. So the Student Advisory Board representatives will be selling tickets, raffle tickets for $1, and the drawing, we'll be selling them all through this week, and then the drawing will be at next week's lecture. So 1 week, if you don't know who your representative is, ask around who it might be. And this week it will be it's hot lunch with Jimenez Live. So we don't know when the lunch will be, but we'll make sure it works for everybody's schedule. So if you have any questions, it should be
Hot lunch, I'm curious about hot.
Soup. We're doing our own soup. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Mirko Zardini to UIC in Chicago, and I will first confess, and this is going to put us all in a state of anxiety for a few moments, that apparently the interim dean laptop does not communicate with the director printer, so consequently I have no notes. Much like the interim dean is in fights now with the former director. We don't communicate technologically either. I would like to say, however, in stalling, that next week is Alessandro Ponte. You will notice that our posters have finally come out. So please pick one up. This is the full schedule. If you weren't here, you've missed Dan Orkhaven, Tom Leader, Cyril Najli, and Ante Liu. 2 weeks ago, you missed Luis Rojo. Tonight, we really begin the lecture series. Mirko initiates the poster, which we're very happy about. We finally get it together for Mirko. And next week is Alessandra, Jeff Day, Michel Lerner, Vinny Maas, Michael Webb, and Mark Linder. So these are the rest of the series. It's very reassuring to be able to welcome Mirko to this institution. Mirko is trained as an architect. This is the facts that I have to recall from memory somehow. So some will be invented, so Mirko can laugh if they're totally made up. Yeah. As you can hear, Mirko is from England. Mirko was trained as an architect. He's been the editor-in-chief of Casabella and Lotus International throughout the 80s and 90s, from 83 to 99, essentially the editor-in-chief of those two magazines. He's also on the editorial board of Domus. He has his criticism and writing has been widely published internationally. In addition to practicing as an architect, and writing and editing, he has also taught throughout Europe and the US at the ETH, at the Architecture Academy in Mendrisio, at Harvard, at Princeton, and many other schools of architecture. Somewhere along the line between teaching and practicing and writing and editing, Mirko found himself to be a kind of accidental curator. Beginning in 2003 with his exhibition called Asphalt, the Character of the City, for the Milan Triennale. And it's really, in a sense, been through his radical reconceptualizations of how architectural exhibitions can contribute to instigating new projects in architecture and urbanism. That last year, Metropolis magazine named Mirko one of 10 game changers in 2012. In addition to Asphalt, Mirko at the CCA has also been the chief curator for a series of, let's say, counterfactual exhibitions that have included The Sense of the City, which is, you could say, about the non-optical ways of understanding the city and the urban, to 1973, Sorry Out of Gas, about the first, one of the first energy crises. to the recent imperfect health, the medicalization of architecture, and some others in there that memory fails me at. But I think all of them speak to a number of things, one of which is how architecture can be operative today, and not, in other words, none of Mirko's exhibitions are retrospective or repertorial. They're really about how architecture and how really curation of exhibition can instigate a new context for projects in architecture, new ways of working that are alternatives to the dominant ones. And so, in addition, for example, the actions, what you can do with a city, in other words, how exhibitions are instigators and mechanisms of activism and not simply passive collections of previous projects or kind of heroic monograph making. And the next series, I think, will be called The Archaeology of the Digital, which I think also suggests Mirko's wit and surprising combination of taking maybe the technology that we think of as closest to us and to show that, in fact, it's already been a series of ruins and repressed past that we might still be able to uncover before it's too late. In any case, the idea that I think Mirko, as a designer, works with the medium of exhibitions to invent new possibilities for architecture. He does it through, again, what we like to call counterintuition here, but I think are really counterfactual hypotheses about the world. They always rub current cliches and platitudes against the grain, so whether it's a social, environmental, or technological assumption or fundamentalism, Mirko's curation and writing and publications always rub those things against the grain to reveal something other than the current context of expectations. And so they immediately solicit and spark new audiences, though some people leave quite upset, which is a good thing. Here's the introduction. Thank you, Tina Fey. I like to think I'm out of the ball when it's on. No, I jump right to the end. So, the long and the short of it is, I think that really, for us operating in large bureaucratic institutions, Mirko was a real role model for us, trying to make something other than what's expected, and no one has done that like Mirko. No one is more savvy than Mirko in terms of institutional politics and getting unlikely things realized to a broad audience. But even though he's always at the center, he always brings a sensibility of the periphery or the edge or the thing that's maybe in the shadows, like asphalt, and what might still be possible. I suppose this is summarized by an anecdote. Recently, when we went to the CCA, we were entering, and I expected to find Mirko sitting in a Kafkaesque situation, somehow 20 layers into the CCA, because that's how it's kind of operated. And so I expected at least a half an hour of screen checks and body cavity searches before being able to access Mirko. And in fact, the first person you see is Mirko, slightly outside of the security camera lens, smoking a cigarette secretly with a few expatriate co-conspirators at the loading dock. And so that's really how Mirko operates. And so I think we find sympathy with that double location. So please join me in welcoming Mirko Zardini, our anarchist-in-chief at the center.
Thank you, Bob. Really, you have a good memory, I have to say. Let's say that I'm very pleased to be here tonight for the invitation. I was a little bit surprised and also intrigued. So what I think I try to do is more or less to explain, try to explain, tell you not what we did at CCA in the last, I realized, almost 7 years. Since I became a kind of accidental director of the center, but more trying to understand why, and eventually how we do certain things, how we try to contribute to the contemporary debate and our effort to help to build a kind of a new platform for this debate. And on the other side, how it is inevitably necessary also to transform the institution that you are part of in order to make this possible. So there are, I don't want to make too many similarities, but there are some correspondence between the problems of a Center for Architecture and a university in respect to the mandate, in respect to the institutional problems, but I let you draw these kind of connections, and perhaps we can have some questions at the end. So let's start in a certain way from the context in which we operate today, and we are now accustomed since the last 3-4 years to the idea that we live in a kind of never-ending situation of a crisis. The systems, the economical, social, cultural situations seem not to work anymore properly, and the signs also of the new and of the alternative, they appear confused and even contradictory all the time. So let's say that architects, urban designers, landscape architects, curators, cultural institutions are working in kind of this confused, in a certain way depressed, ever-changing cultural climate. Certainly there is a condition that we didn't expect 10 or 20 years ago when the way of working and thinking was totally different and was framed in a kind of optimism related to the kind of economic situation of that moment. Anyway, circumstances are always different, and you know, they are different in different ways and every time. So the fact that we feel as we are venturing kind of uncharted territory is nothing new. We are not the first to be overwhelmed by this increasingly rapidly change, or to feel pressed to rethink our disciplines and boundaries of our field of study. What is interesting to note is, in a certain way, that I would like to go to this point, this idea of crisis is in reality part of a much longer process of historical transformations. So it's part of a long series of crises. And I'd like to make, for me, very clear the point that 1973, with the first oil shock crisis, is in a certain way a very important moment in which we can face this kind of abrupt disenchantment with ideas on progress and development. Even if this crisis, here the page of the New York Times speaking of the problem with the crisis and the war between Israel and the Arab countries and the cut of oil export 5% a month. That crisis was purely a political, financial situation which provoked this shortage of oil, but nevertheless was forcing the Western country for the first time to face a situation in which there was a shortage of resources, which I think is symbolically very important for us to take in mind, and also was in a certain way a shock, because it was the first time in which the idea of development, which Henry Truman made at the center of his speech in 1949 and the inaugural address, was questioned. That brings us to think that this kind of period from the Second World War in 1970s was not the general trend, that these 20 years, the glorious 20 years or 30 years, as some historians that define that period, could be considered perhaps more an exception than the kind of general trend that we are moving through. And we arrive to the point that today, and I'm quoting here a note by Ivan Illich, no sane person can project the future of the economic utopia of endless growth in which we live as anything but catastrophe sooner or later. In fact, universal compulsory ideas, rules and attitudes sometimes produce effects that are precisely opposite to those that its proponents say they intend. And I'd like you to think a little bit of that, because I think that this very modern idea behind this kind of quote, is very important for the question that I would like to address later in this presentation. Clearly, the institutions also, and I speak of cultural institutions, I speak of museum, I speak of universities, just to give you first examples. This is the vault, one of the vault in which we store some of the paper archive at the CCA. The institutions are also affected by this kind of situation in a certain way, and they need, there is the necessity to reframe the way of operating and the mission in respect to the current circumstances. It is very interesting to note that most of the institutions relating to architectural centers, a lot of them were created in the period between the 70s, end of the 70s and the 90s. The CCA was created in 1979, opened in 1989, Deutsche Architecture Museum in Frankfurt 1979, Architectural Museum in Basel 1984, NIE in Rotterdam 1988, Heinz Architectural Center in Pittsburgh 1990, plus there were also in Europe some institutions like the architectural department created in that moment at the Coburg and also the Musée d'Orsay. These institutions were created in that moment, and that is quite interesting to know that in that period, from the 70s to the 90s, architectural history was playing a crucial role in defining the architectural discourse. Architectural theory was emerging as a new specialized discipline in America and in British universities mainly. And the archives was seen through the Michel Foucault reading not anymore as a passive collection of the past, but as an active and controlling system of enunciation. So what I will say is that all the institutions were based on a very clear, creating a very specific context within a certain way, a very clear mandate in that moment. They really, through their collection, the permanent exhibition in the galleries, exhibition programs, full-time curators, they created really an important period that can be recognizable in the history of architecture thinking. It's not the first time that architecture works has been displayed, other people have written about that, but let's say that the exhibition presenting the history of architecture or architecture in certain way are in large measure a phenomenon of the late 20th century architecture and museological culture related to this and other centers of architecture. So, I made this point because in a certain way what is very important for me is comparing that moment with the current situation and to see how today you could react to the crisis, if you want to summarize it with that word, of the modern world in a different way than the disciplinary historical approach that most of these institutions have taken in the 80s. And you can see some efforts done by some institutions in this respect, some projects, cultural projects move in this direction. Just to mention to you the small-scale Big Change exhibition at the MoMA, but also the exhibition of foreclosure and on the ties in New York, and also the architectural consequence manifesto by the NIE in Rotterdam by Ole Bouw. So what was the point of this manifesto, of this exhibition, was to try to find an operative field for the architectural discourse connecting to a changing reality as it is today. It can be the foreclosure, could be the climate change, it could be socio-economical condition as Ole Bouwman was addressing. So in a certain way I call all these architectural good intentions, which means that the problem for me, for us, is that in reality I do not believe that you can really contribute to a contemporary situation if your way to look at the problems or your way of framing the problem is the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago. And my criticism of all this position is that in reality most of the contemporary thinking, even if on architecture looking for alternative strategy for the urban architecture commitment and so on, is still framed as a kind of late continuation of a kind of modern attitude that has not been criticized or analyzed in a proper way. So I will go back to this point later when I speak of an institution like health. So what do we try to do as I say is before to pretend, I can address this now. One of the main issues of this attitude, in my opinion, is that you do not only pretend to have architecture as a problem-solving situation. Architecture capacity to resolve present problems is not that I'm questioning that. I'm questioning the extent to which you can go with this kind of intentions. I think that this is a very interesting quote by Machiavelli, which we used when we worked on the Imperfect Health exhibition. The problem is never to pretend to solve current troubles, if you want, but to think which kind of new troubles you are going to create in producing a solution for that. And so it's always, for me, a problem that you define, you never solve troubles, you only create different ones. So which different troubles do you want to create? And in which direction do you want to go in creating these troubles? So that is a very different way to look at the effect of architecture than pretending that architects are able to find a solution to every problem. I will perhaps speak later of these issues about health, but you know that the reason that we did this exhibition, Perfect Health, is because we wanted to explore the implication of the action of the architects. And in modern architecture, for example, the idea of sanatorium was considered the solution to the problem of health. In reality, 80% of the people who were going through sanatorium, they died. And the solution was only found when the medical research has produced the proper treatment for these people. Does it mean that architecture has no effect? No, but it's another kind of effect that architecture could put in place. So what we tried at the CCA was in a certain way to describe that, to re-examine the assumptions on which architects operate today, and to try to frame the problems in a different way, to try to develop a kind of to escape the current commonplace around these kind of things, and to develop a kind of counter-research. So in a certain way, it was a study and a revision of the false assumptions, preconceptions, and attitudes. It was an effort to reveal the unexamined and often hidden agendas. In a certain way, it was the way to investigate the gray zone at the crossroads of contemporary culture, contemporary society, and contemporary architecture. And also, especially, to critically expose these contradictions. 30 years after this kind of the creation of this center with this kind of very specific cultural agenda in the 70s, 80s, disciplinary autonomy, history, theory, the effort to define architecture as and to make architecture recognized as a discipline. Today, all these kind of centers, they are facing a totally different issues for me, is in a certain way to participate to a construction of a new knowledge and making this knowledge really productive. And I'm not speaking of creative industry here, you know, because it's something that really I like to escape this kind of work. So in a certain way, the idea of producing counter-research on fundamental alternatives to current pre-packaged solutions, and to offer this as a specific contribution to the debate and the effort to build or to look for some alternatives. One, I go briefly through some of the approaches that we did, trying to explain a little bit, not what we did again, but why we did certain approaches, which was the intention behind that. Sometimes we've been successful, sometimes not, it is normal. But when we did this exhibition like Sense of the City in 2005, the idea was to challenge the prevalence of the visual in our definition and perception of the environment. It was also a critique of the last 20 years of architecture, which were based on a prevalence of the image. And in order to develop this kind of critique, it was an effort to discover this kind of idea of experience as one element of resistance, respect that. The idea of atmosphere, the idea of character, especially the idea of character is not new in the architectural thinking. And framing that in respect to some current research, especially in the field of anthropology, in which we can see very clearly that there is a rediscovery of the so-called bodies, not in psychophysical terms, but as a cultural definition, as elements of transformation and resistance in the contemporary situation. So, one problem of this exhibition was that it was seen by some people as a kind of, how can I say, promotion of the economy of experience, a kind of promotion of the idea of the city as a consumer place, a place where you consume experience. It was not the intention, so we tried to correct that with some other intervention that we did after. We also started to address the issues of environment, and it was an effort to escape, also in this case, some of the current generic definition about the environment trying to work with two people like Philippe Lam and Gilles Clément. On one side, trying to see, to bring in the idea of the interior, the idea of climate. So again, to develop the idea of the interior more in terms of a different kind of experience. And in the case of Gilles Clément, it was mainly the idea to address not only the problem of biodiversity. This is a kind of montage of the investigation of 1 year of Gilles Clément, who spent every week for 1 year, some time on this platform in the middle of a big field that he had bought, just to record all the transformation of this kind of field, but also tracing the problem of the impact of the intervention of the humans and the human waste in shaping this kind of second level nature that is the result of our interaction with the environment. Another issues again related to the environment, if you want, is again addressing the issues of 1973 soil gas, which was the reason of this choice of this moment was, I think it is clear now in respect to what I said before, our way of reading this crisis is a crucial one. It was really the effort to look at this as a real moment of change in our culture and in our way to perceive the environment. And also we consider that moment very interesting in order to reveal the contradiction between unregulated technological advance and social equality. In reality, we found a lot of projects of that period very interesting, not only or not mainly for their technological solution, which were till that moment the production of counterculture and were considered absolutely irrelevant or exotic, and suddenly they became occupied the center of the discussion. But because also in that moment there was an understanding of the technological transformation in some of these projects and these groups as part of a much larger project related to what became later the sustainable issues, which was not addressed in a technocratic way as we see today, but connecting that to the economical and social conditions they are inevitably part of. Some ideas of living in London and Tokyo were we presented two groups of projects, one by Stephen Taylor from London, one by Nishizawa, the younger partner of Sana. Apparently, if you look at that from a formal point of view, this kind of project could be considered, could end up, and they ended up sometimes, in a kind of a minimalist architecture book. And in reality, we wanted to use these projects to show, how can I say, the kind of resistance of different culture to an homogenization process. Because the culture of living implied in the project of Stephen Taylor and the culture of living implied in the project of Nishizawa are totally different in respect to the idea of family, to the idea of privacy, to the idea of semi-public or public space and relationships. So in a certain way it was our warning in respect to some tendency to read contemporary architecture as a kind of homogeneous product that could be presented everywhere. And action, what you can do with the city was again a little bit trying to continue the discussion starting with the sense of the city, but also was an effort to suggest a different possibility for some of the micro-scale actions that we can find more and more in our urban context. We collected 99 of them. And the most important thing was the collecting all of these and trying to put all of them together. Because one of the issues of this kind of micro-scale intervention determined by the community or the individuals is that in a certain way they are very often not really effective, and it could be also dangerous in the sense that the scope of their intervention is very limited and could appear sometimes very self-congratulatory at the end. You can get something. Our point is that the combination of different of these kind of actions could really produce a total different strategy in order to address the issues of larger scale transformation at the urban scale. Which, by the way, we created also a website, we collected all of them. It was not really, it was a nice effort, but it was not really as successful as we could have expected in terms of real impact in some of the projects, at least in some cities that we were more trying to see if it was possible to introduce these kind of things. We address again this idea of modern idea, some of the myths of modernity, one of them speed limits, which was a kind of effort to revisit the myth of speed and efficiency. In a certain way, try to question the idea of efficiency and fluid and frictionless situation that more and more architecture and urban planning are trying to introduce in our environment. And also to question the idea of productivity, that the tyranny of productivity upon speed that is now emerging more and more also in our contemporary society. In a certain way, it was really to try to question one of the fundative myth of modernity, in which speed is really not only a symbolic element, but also a very effective component of efficiency and productivity. And with this project on other space odysseys, we really wanted to analyze the fascination that we had with technologies. It was the combination of some projects of Super Studio, of Michael Molzen and Greg Lee. Michael Molzen presented the kind of techno-bureaucracy of our time with the project for a laboratory for the outer space exploration. Greg Lee presented the mythology of the technological development with this kind of script and scenarios for some science fiction films, and Super Studio, of which we presented this Moon Highway project, but also the last project that they did, which was an investigation on the tools of the farmer in the countryside of Tuscany, which was quite an interesting analysis and reflection on the power of tools and the power of technologies in different contexts. Journeys, out traveling fluid ideas and building rearrange our environments, was a way to look at the idea of borders, not in terms of the usual way of walls, conflicts, but to look at how the moving of ideas and objects and people have produced totally different effect in different cultures. Clearly, you have to deal with the problem of the bureaucratic regulation of movements, and the reason of these images is because in the European community there are very clear regulations which makes possible for these to travel, otherwise they are not recognized anymore as a proper, how do you call them, cucumber. They are not recognized as cucumber if their shape is not inside a certain kind of specific limitations. So you have in all the languages of the European community, the different regulation which tells you which is a real cucumber and what could move through the European community. Otherwise, it could not, because it is not really properly recognized. But there are some ideas. For example, this one is the moving of entire community in northern Canada in the 50s and 60s because of this idea of a new plan of modernization of the central government, implying that all the native population to abandon their houses and to be regrouped in villages and towns. And most of them, they address that moving their old house, you see in the films, through the ground and the lakes in order to create these new villages with the old houses, move through the different kind of things. And one of the last things again was a reflection on the responsibility, ethical, technological, and professional contribution of architecture during the Second World War, which was a way to analyze, in reality the intention was to analyze the intellectual, moral and ethical responsibilities of being part of a certain process. So questioning the neutrality of a professional and technical contribution, but suggesting that in reality there is an intellectual and moral responsibility in what we do, which was then demonstrated through the different contribution of the different architects to urban planning, specific design, equally distributed in terms of the different sides of the war, with architects contributing to the mass destruction system in a consistent way. Clearly, these are questions that it is difficult to answer, but nevertheless, we cannot live without questioning ourselves every time, whatever we do, which is our role in this kind of respect. And the health was in reality, again, not only a way to question this problem of healthism, of this kind of larger and larger medicalization of our society, but also the pretension very often of architecture to offer a cure to the medical issues, while in reality our point is very simple, that architecture cannot offer any cure. Maximum you can do is taking care. And taking care of something is very different than to pretend to have a cure to some specific problem in the case of medicalization of some specific illness. So it was a way to address these issues of the limits of architecture, and perhaps defining the constraints in which we can operate properly. It means that also give us much more power and freedom to operate in a more effective and strategic way, as long as we do not pretend to solve, for example, the problem of health through architecture, but in a way that we can pretend to address the issues of taking care of the environment, of the people, of the sick people in respect to these kind of conditions. It is also something very contemporary. It's the discussion on the policy of Bloomberg in New York, and the policy of producing, forcing a new symbolic strategy, but also a functional strategy to make you move in order to be fit, is a kind part of the strategy against obesity. And there are a lot of moral questions about that kind of things. I have nothing against the idea of movement, but pretending not to understand that this is really part of a large agenda in which, in a certain way, you are not anymore part of a situation like the one of the 60s and 70s, in which there was the idea of public health, which was a shared interest in the condition of the populations and the effort to improve the condition of the population, but is in a certain way shaped in a totally different way, in which each of us is responsible of his or her own health. And if you do not perfectly fit these kind of rules that have been established for you, or the new canons that have been established for you, you are emarginated. And to be emarginated in this kind of process means that you don't access perhaps anymore social health insurance or these kind of things. So I feel that there are a lot of ambiguous issues behind these kind of things of putting the stairs instead than the elevator in front of you when you enter a building, as it happened, for example, in the new building of Cooper Union by Morphosis in New York. Also, in that case, we don't have any real answer. It's very difficult. But to pretend that there are not moral, political, social ambiguities in these kind of things, and pretend that it is simply good to do certain kind of things is a little bit a very shortcut that I doubt that we can take. So, all of what you're seeing here are exhibitions, and exhibition is for us a kind of natural tool to tell a story, to raise an issue, to raise a problem. In reality, what we try to do with this exhibition is not to do any more exhibition of architecture, but the exhibition about, around, on architecture. So in which architecture was part of a larger discourse, health, sensorial, the war, in which architecture was shown in its interrelation with this, showing both the limitation but also in a certain way, the incredible role that architecture has played or could play in this kind of situation. And I think it's very important today to do that, because if architecture is not able, or urban planning or landscape, is not able to connect to some of the general issues of our transforming societies, it will become irrelevant. So I really think that this kind of connection is very, very important. All these exhibitions, of course, are based on the assumption that you are not showing a building. The buildings are outside where they are. So what you are showing in the exhibition is not the building, but is the thinking of the building, the material around the building, the mediatization of that, the ideas of architectures. Is a totally different kind of way to present a thinking on architecture than just presenting a collection of photographs on some of the buildings realized recently. So is this idea to present this kind of thinking and this kind of reflection, this kind of ideas, find a way to communicate it through the exhibitions, but has always found a way to communicate through publications. Is a normal way to expand this kind of discussion about the thinking about architecture. It's nothing new. But what I think is interesting is to combine together exhibition, publication, and the, let's say, online presence. Because more and more our environment is shaped by the presence of the technology, which makes territoriality less and less relevant in terms of discussion and research. And this is also a very critical issue for most of the institutions like museums that base their assumption on the idea to educate the community that physically access that institution. And that is not anymore true, that you can access any institution, any research, not physically, but in geographical conditions. So in a certain way, there is also a mix-up of curatorial and editorial component, which is coming back in a kind of unique field, which you can call an expanding curatorial field or an expanding editorial field, but at the end, these kind of things are overlapping more and more, making the system more and more interesting, and also making a system inevitably dealing with the changing status of the object. This is in our collection. It's written, please return to anyone, thank you. And unfortunately, well, it was donated to us, but at the end, it is useless to return to anyone or to anybody because it's totally inaccessible. And this one is still accessible. It's a sketch by Frank Gehry. But you know, this kind of environment is producing a different system of communication, a different system of status of the objects, and a different system most probably also of communicating in the future this kind of projects in a different way than the usual way that we are accustomed to through the paper system. So it's really an incredible shift in the paradigm of production that you know very well because you are part of that. We are starting to deal with the experiment of 10, 15 years ago, and they look already a kind of archaeological pattern in respect to the contemporary evolution, even if you see there the seed of a lot of transformation that are happening today. And so what really is happening to, and I like to close because I see that it took a little bit of time, is that it is also important to, it's very difficult to develop a certain kind of reflection discourse and to pretend to do that inside a traditional institution. Also the institution, they have to change, they have to adapt, to incorporate, to respond. So the same kind of criticism that you can make to architecture or to some topics in architecture, you have to make to the institution itself. I'm not promoting you to question Bob Sommel and university programs here, but in a certain way for us at CCA, it was very, very important to understand how can you do this kind of work, which is in reality the mission that you have, what you really want to do. And what we realized is that in reality, we started to really question the idea of the education, which is at the base of a lot of institutions. Because we think that education, even if through the system of the online presence, which is amplifying that through the idea of broadcasting, is in reality based on the assumption that there is one voice and there are a lot of listeners to this voice. We don't think that it is the only way. We think that the idea of a conversation, for example, is a more interesting one to combine, if you want, with the traditional idea of education, or better, the idea of the broadcasting, that is the, how can I say, the incarnation of this idea of education in the current strategy. So we really thought that in a certain way it was important for us to think of the institution as two buildings in a certain way. One is the physical one, you see this one is a photo by Takayama from the room of the hotel he was staying. So that is the CCA. It was, because there are some old banners there. It is a physical building in which you develop some exploration, some exhibition, some investigation, in which you have access, kind of laboratory, test case, in which you have access to a certain group of physical people physically coming to the building, having a certain kind of experience, a certain kind of relationship with you. And the other is a second kind of building, which is totally a network of presence online, in which you are supposed to contribute there with a different kind of material, if related to that, on research oriented, again, on the same topics, and to establish a conversation. And what is interesting for us is that these two mechanisms, they can really produce, because they're very different, they can really produce a criticism, each one to the other one, in order to create the tensions inside the institution, which will avoid the institution to be too much self-confident on one direction or one kind of things. So, because that is really the most important things I feel is never really to feel too much self-confident about yourself. Always question what you are doing and thinking if there are other ways to do things. And what I present you today is really simply part of a tentatives to move the discussion and the transformation of the institution in certain directions. And clearly they are, I found one day looking at the archive this sentence by Mata Clark, which I found is corresponding to the feeling that I have when I work at CCA. So I can read for you. Here is what we have to offer you in its most elaborate form: confusion guided by a clear sense of purpose. And that is really what I think we are trying to do. I'm sure that in 10, 20, 30 years, what appears to us confusion will be seen, interpreted as very clear patterns, but when you are inside the certain kind of situations, it's very difficult to understand in which kind of patterns you are moving. And it's better to accept this idea that you are more working in a tentative ways, trying to push in certain directions, hoping that they are the right ones, because you never know. So thank you very much. If there are questions, okay, my usual reaction is give you 1 second to tell me if there are questions.
We have a lot of time to kill before dinner. So
Yeah. No, I already had a conversation with some of you for your newspaper, which I really found, your magazine, sorry, which I really found very interesting. I had a few minutes to look at that. At least I had the impression of life in this magazine, which is very rare for me to find in the other magazine that I am looking at. So, honestly, they asked me almost everything, and I don't know if I answered their questions, but you can rely on them. If you have any questions, I'm sure that they will be able to elaborate what I told them in a proper way, responding to also your doubt and your kind of thinking questions. Oh, okay.
To avoid the irrelevance, it seems to me when I listen to people, to avoid the irrelevance of architecture, the exhibitions that you've done so far at CCA, not show buildings, but address architecture more legally. And I guess I wonder if you could elaborate on this. It's because it deals with the public in different.
We show also buildings, and but one of the critique that we receive from the architects, Montreal architects, and also some of the students, some professors of the school at the University of Montreal, is that it is not architecture because you have not enough drawing. And it's not true. Sometimes we do also exhibition with a lot of drawings, but it's not the point. The point is that I feel that if you limit the reflection of architecture only to the disciplinary component, I have nothing against that. And I think that in some historical moment it was very, very important. and I mentioned the period in which some of these central museums were being created. It was very, very important. I only say that today, I feel that it's more strategic to be able to link the architecture, ideas, buildings, strategy, whatever, to a larger themes in which the contemporary society can recognize itself. Because this is showing the possibility of architecture to contribute to that. Again, which kind of contribution, not pretending to solve the problems, but pretending to direct the troubles from a certain kind of definition to another kind of definitions, to making the troubles evolving in a different way than they are now. That is more or less the intention that we have. And I feel confident that this is something that is important to do today. That is also the reason that we try not to do monographic show. Not because a monographic show is wrong in itself, but because in the last 20 years it has been embedded with these expectations about archival historical analysis or on the promotion of some architects in a kind of mediatization, in this kind of bad word, but this kind of star system process that has been put in place, in which exhibition were very often a marketing strategy in these kind of things. So we think that it's very difficult to take this format on a graphic show and be able to dismantle this from the interior so that you can use that in a different way than it has been in the last 20 years. And even if you do that, the result is never so strong as if you, on the contrary, address this on a thematic way. So we did some shows, like for example, two architects and put them together in order to create some conflictual situation, some discussion. And the show that we did on Sterling archive, that it was related to, it is in our collection, and we did with Yale and this and that. In reality, we tried to do that from the inside of the show, this monographic show, not to make this very archival, but also to raise some issues. It was very difficult. In a certain way, the project failed to a certain extent in this kind of thing. That was the reason that we think that in this situation, this kind of thematic things are very important. Which is not a way to say that architecture has not its disciplinary role at all. It's saying that framing this inside a larger thematic issue. Yeah, there was one, sorry, there was one there.
I think this question relates to the question just asked. Is it important as an architect to develop specifically architectural modes or tools to curate and exhibit what you're trying to get across? Does that become part of your thinking?
Yes, we try to do that. And we try to do that in different ways. Mainly, a lot, for us, the installation or whatever, the mise en scène is really part of the curating process. So we really choose carefully the people involved in respect to their, how can I say, specific interest and what we want to communicate in certain exhibitions. So the choice of the people working on the installation of the graphic is always related to our wish to underline certain things. We try very often to do very subtle things. For example, the sense of the city was not at all a kind of thematic park experiment, even if it was possible to have a really sensorial engagement. It was an effort to maintain a traditional exhibition, introducing some breaking of the code inside the traditional way to do an exhibit display. So sometimes you touch, sometimes you could do other things, but the format was always the same, so you could understand that because of the breaking of the code, not because you were in a totally immersive new situation in which you had it. It's not easy to do that. We try, and sometimes we are successful and sometimes not, but the installation for us is not an installation, it's the, how can I say, the continuation of a critical research which started from the research, go on with the curatorial, and is at the very end a highly curatorial, the installation and the graphic at the end.
Can you share with us some thoughts on your earlier work in Italy, Lotus and Domus, and your work here at CCA in North America? What continuities have stayed with you, and what contrasts have presented themselves?
Yeah, let's say that there was more than Casabel, not only the editorial work in Italy, but also the work at the ETH in Zurich, which was about 10 years time. And it was a kind of accumulations, if I look at in retrospective now, of issues and problems that in reality I find now still in the exhibition that, or in the research that we are doing. In a certain way, I sometimes am scared because I feel that I have the impression that I always did not the same thing for all the time. That it's not really different. It was different at the maturity, it was different in the context, it was different but I really sometimes have the impression that most probably I'm doing always the same thing, and only in a different way. And I don't know if it is good or bad. And what I want to say is that it was interesting that period, and I'm speaking of the late 70s, 80s, because having grown up studying in Venice University, when Instituto in Venice was a really interesting place because of the presence of an incredible number of people like Tafuti, Rossi, Monino, De Carlo, Gotti, and so on, Scarpa, that died just when I started the programs at the university. But anyway, it was very important, this formation as architecture, not in professional terms, but as an intellectual activity that you develop through the profession, through the teaching, through the curatorial, through the editorial work. So it was something that in a certain way is characterizing also my work at the CCA, and also perhaps the fact that I'm able to manage such a multifaceted institution is because I had this kind of background, this kind of training in different fields. Yeah?
You traced the origins of the CCA to this particular moment in the relationship of institutions and how the curatorial editorial project of the institution questions and runs counter to that history to a certain extent, or very much so. Have you been able, since we spent a lot of time looking at the image of the physical archive of the CCA, which is so much of what the institution itself is about, have you thought about or approached the question of the archive itself from this perspective?
We have done two things. The first is to start a kind of institutional archive which didn't exist, and to develop an oral history of the institution to understand better the genealogy of an institution. Something that other institutions they are doing is very, very important. On the other side, we developed a description of the collection, and we try to understand which are the strengths and the weaknesses of this collection. And we have different opinions about that. But for me, CCA is clearly a modern institution in which you can address to link to modernity both the photographic collection that we have, and that is one of the most interesting photographic collection in architecture, specifically built around architecture, and also the collection of CCA archives and material, which is going from the 19th century to the 20th century to the second half of the 20th century with the acquisition of these big archives. And we are continuing this strategy of acquisition of archive. And in the past, CCA has acquired archive like Rossi, Eisenman, Hayduk, Sterling, Sally Price. And we continue this strategy, but now we don't acquire anymore. Mainly because of the credibility, I think, of the activities that we do. We now receive this material by donation. So we have now developed a strategy where we receive the archive of Amata Clark, the private archive, as a donation. We receive the Genere archive in Chandigarh as a donation, and we received also the Avalos and Herreros archive. And when I speak of Avalos and Herreros, it tells you that we are moving in a certain way. What was important to CCA is to build a field for research. It's very successful today because a lot of investigation today are related to that period after Second World War. What we are trying to do now is to build a kind of field for investigation for the future. So we are starting to collect, I can say, the near contemporary, also the contemporary. And that is always more and more risky. But we do that trying to define some line of investigation that we want to explore. And one is the one related to the sustainable approaches. We are working on the 1970s material. Another is the idea of the archaeology of the digital. We try to capture a specific moment in which we consider there was a shift in the paradigm of thinking architecture and producing architectural approaches in a certain way. And we are moving in this direction. Clearly, what is very important is to make an assessment of what is important for you and what is not important, the collection that you have. And it is not that that is difficult to do. Is that is, for me, it's not so difficult to do, but the problem is that there is always a risk, because the assessment of what is important or not is really changing in time. So what we consider today not anymore, not so strategic, perhaps could be considered strategic in 10 and 20 years. But what we are trying to do is again to go on this strategy of building the collection. What is also interesting is that in this respect, you have to consider that collection of CCA is mainly based on projects, books, and photography, just going to media. Projects can be drawings or can be archives, mainly archives because they represent more this complexity of situation. What is important to know is to realize that today a large part of the archive is constituted by the activities that the institution does. Lectures, seminars, all these kind of events related to discussion, research. Because more and more these kind of things are recorded. In a certain way, they are becoming part of the collection, as could have been a book or a letter 10, 20 years ago. So there is a little bit a problem in relation to that in terms also of quantity, and there are also some questions about that.
I have a question about historically that wasn't the case, and architects were often the positive future makers. So my question to you is, if you want to reframe the problems differently, which I appreciate very much, how can we reimagine a positive future without returning to, say, utopian models of intervention?
I think that it's very difficult for me a little bit questionable to have in mind an idea of the future and then to pretend to go to that point and to realize that. What I feel more interesting is to analyze the energies which are in the field today and to try to stress more the energies that you feel more productive in defining a possible direction for the future. And honestly, in this sense, there are some values that you can consider more than others. And in this kind of stressing some forces instead than other ones. So today, for example, the problem of inequality is for me a very big issue. And how you can address this problem in this kind of situation. The problem also, if you want to call environmental issues, is quite an important one. The problem is that you have to deconstruct this idea of greenwashing that is associated to that, especially in our field in architecture. As soon as I hear the word sustainable, I start to be worried because I already see what could be the possible outcome of this kind of things. So, for me, in this sense, it's a really more a political position in a field of forces and trying to, how can I say, give more visibility or more resonance to some of these instead than others. But in the name of the future, which I'm not able to foresee, but in the name of some values that I feel confident that I can, I feel confident that I can sustain.
One last thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Back to that, and maybe Alexander's question also, which, but in the periodization, now I get it, that there's the two certainties, the certainties of modernism, which was about the future, and the certainties of the archive, and the Museum of Architecture, which was about the past. And that your project is sort of against both certainties, of architects and historians, or archivists or curators. So when I call you an accidental curator, maybe I mean you're also a curator of accidents. Which is to say that you stage uncertainty. Like that your project, let's say, is about staging uncertainties, as opposed to whether the certainty of the future or the certainty of the past was previous to regimes. And so back to Alexander's question, which I think Alexander was asking the suspicion that we might have, which is, why aren't you doing architecture? But I mean, another way to read it is that you internalize the lessons of counter architecture from the 70s and simply expanded it into curation and exhibitions. But it's not as if you left architecture, but basically you simply took the insights of that other 70s, not the archivist, curator, historian, but certain practices of the 70s, you've now simply expanded into the medium of exhibitions and curation. So you don't need to show certain economic projects because they are now in the way that you stage exhibitions, let's say.
That is also the reason that I really am very happy to have at CCA the archivists Eric Rice and Martha Clark, because in a certain way they are, how can I say, the theoretical foundation of what theoretical is too much, but anyway, kind of inspirational presence for what we are trying to do. So it's totally true, and I also recognize that what I'm trying to do has a very limited historical pace. Perhaps it would be good for a certain period of time, and it's not always the right things to do. How can I say, counter-architecture for me is also a kind of idea of a counter-research that you can do in order to dismantle this kind of predefined concept, which are at the base of most of the operations that we do today, not only in architecture, in our kind of things. So in a certain way, what I think for me is very important is the presence of a critical thinking, and in a certain way the idea of conflict and opposition is very, very important. And on the contrary, what I see today is a kind of how can I say, admiration for fluidity. I'm not speaking now in formal terms or whatever, I'm speaking really in social terms and in political terms and in cultural terms. The idea of no resistance, the kind of a perfect, smooth, theoretical definitions of the problem, which is in a certain way avoiding conflicts most of the time. And in this sense, I'm also going back to the 70s. I'm really thinking that conflicts are highly productive, like a crisis. And if it was not for a crisis, I was never SCCA, because there could be plenty of very good directors doing very, very good things in a more traditional way. And most probably, if it was not for a crisis, we will not have the chance that we are dealing with today. We can lose a lot, but also we can gain a lot. And I like your definition. In fact, I marked down, and I credit you for the. Your definition is absolutely correct, and the only issue that I see with that is that most probably it will be historicized, as I've been historicizing the beginning of this institution in a short period of time, showing that it is not anymore this position. It will not be anymore strategic to achieve a certain kind of result that in that moment will be considered more relevant. So, knowing that, the only problem is to understand when you have to stop.